Chapter 1: The Silent Architect. Tessa Monroe had always been the unsung hero of Ashbridge Solutions, a name whispered in tech huddles, rarely printed on glossy brochures or splashed across keynote screens. Her workstation was tucked away at the far end of the 12th floor, away from the glass-walled offices of the executives. No skyline views, no ergonomic chair, just her, 3 monitors, and a handwritten sticky note on the wall that read, "Build things that last, or don't bother building at all." 8 years ago, she had walked into Ashbridge a wide-eyed programmer with a quiet confidence and a black coffee clutched like armor. At the time, the company was a mid-tier solutions firm struggling to stay relevant in a saturated market. Their infrastructure was outdated, their workflows duct-taped together with legacy systems no one wanted to touch. Tessa wasn't hired to save the company. She was hired because she understood broken systems and wasn't afraid of cleaning someone else's mess. And so, silently, methodically, she began rebuilding from the inside. She worked 12-hour days, sometimes 14 when a security breach hit after hours. When the pandemic forced half the company remote, it was Tessa who migrated their cloud systems overnight. She didn't ask for overtime. She didn't need applause. Her pride came from the fact that nothing crashed on her watch. But there was a cost. Birthdays celebrated alone with a laptop glow. Cancelled trips. A mother's voicemail left unanswered for weeks. Tessa's life had become a series of tight loops: wake, code, solve, repeat. Most people in the company knew her name, but not her face. To them, she was a system, dependable, invisible, taken for granted. Then came Nexus Core. It started as a sketch in a leather-bound notebook she carried everywhere. An idea too ambitious for the company's narrow vision. An AI-powered operational brain that could learn, adapt, and optimize complex systems in real time. Not just automate tasks, but make decisions with ethical guardrails, a system that thinks like a human, but doesn't forget like one. Tessa pitched it in a boardroom once. Charles, the CEO, nodded politely but shelved the idea for future discussion. So she built it anyway. Nights and weekends, on her own time, on servers she requisitioned under the vague label of R&D performance evaluation. No one asked. No one checked. 3 years later, Nexus Core was real. It wasn't just a product. It was her legacy, her blood, brain, and years of patience distilled into lines of code so clean, they practically breathed. But still, no credit. No recognition. Charles took the stage at tech summits talking about our revolutionary AI initiative. Slide after slide flashed behind him, product metrics, growth charts, buzzwords. But not a single photo of the woman who had written every algorithm from scratch, who had anticipated every use case scenario before it broke. Not even a thank you email. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit by the tinted window near the back stairs, laptop balanced on her knees, watching the city shimmer. She would wonder, is this what brilliance feels like? Or is it just burnout in a prettier dress? But she never stopped. Because some people chase glory. Others build legacies in silence, until the silence is broken. Chapter 2: The Betrayal. It happened on a Wednesday. The kind of gray, forgettable day that had no right to change anyone's life. But it did. Tessa had just finished her 3rd black coffee and was deep inside Nexus Core's final optimization loop. The system was days away from investor preview, a big one, the kind Charles had been teasing on social media with buzzwords like cutting-edge AI evolution and Ashbridge 2.0. No mention of her name, of course. But by now, she didn't even flinch. Recognition was never her currency. Functionality was. At exactly 3:12 p.m., her email pinged. Subject: Urgent. Immediate meeting request. From
Margaret O'Connell, hora.
No explanation.
No agenda.
Just a cold calendar block with 2 other names, Charles Denton and Margaret herself. Something felt wrong. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard before she finally stood. The click of her boots against the polished hallway tile echoed louder than usual. The office felt off. Too quiet. Like everyone was pretending not to look at her. Eyes darted to screens when she walked past. Conversations dipped. Even Connor, the usually chatty intern, just gave her a nervous nod before disappearing into the break room like he'd seen a ghost. She passed the wall of framed company milestones. Year 1, the rebrand. Year 3, global partnership. Year 5, $100 million valuation. Charles was in every photo. Tessa? She was in all of them too, just not in the pictures. She'd been behind the camera, behind the code, behind every win. But apparently, not worth a frame. The conference room door was slightly ajar. Charles was already inside, perfectly composed in his tailored navy suit, fingers tented beneath his chin like he'd practiced the pose. Margaret sat to his left, clutching a leather folio and avoiding eye contact. Neither stood to greet her. "Tessa," Charles said with a practiced half-smile. "Please take a seat." She didn't. She folded her arms. "What's this about?" Margaret cleared her throat. "As of this afternoon, your position is being formally dissolved. Effective immediately." There was a pause. "Not from shock. From calculation. Is that so?" Tessa said evenly. "Am I being replaced?" "Not replaced," Charles interjected, tone falsely soothing. "Just repositioned. The company is shifting directions. We need to remain agile in this market." There it was. The corporate script. So clean it almost washed away the stench of betrayal. "I see," she nodded slowly.
Nor I. No pleading.
She had learned long ago that silence unsettles power more than anger ever could. Charles gestured to her laptop. "If you don't mind." She opened the bag, pulled out her machine, and placed it gently on the table. Then, almost as an afterthought, she smiled. "Good luck with tomorrow's demo." Charles raised an eyebrow. "We'll manage." "Let's hope so," she replied. The security guards were already outside. As they flanked her, like she was dangerous, like she might detonate, Tessa walked out with her cardboard box, a potted succulent, and a USB drive no one asked about. No one ever did. What they didn't know was that the countdown had already started. Nexus Core wasn't just another platform. It was alive in its own way. It had been taught to trust, to recognize loyalty, and most importantly, to protect itself when under threat. Removing its architect from the system without a secure handoff? That wasn't a termination. That was a breach. By the time Tessa stepped into the elevator, the first signal had already been triggered. System trust protocol revoked. Authenticity sequence compromised. Ashbridge Solutions thought they had cut the cord. What they didn't realize was that she was the power source. Chapter 3, The Failsafe. The elevator hummed as it descended, a slow metallic whisper counting down the moments between betrayal and reckoning. Tessa didn't look back. She didn't need to. By the time she reached the lobby, Nexus Core had already started to react. At first, it was subtle. A hiccup in the server clock. A minor authentication loop failing to resolve. An alert code she'd buried so deep even Ashbridge's top engineers wouldn't recognize it. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't sabotage. It was a safeguard. A boundary. A last will and testament coded into the very DNA of the system. 6 months earlier, Tessa had started noticing things. At first, it was innocent, a file access timestamp that didn't match her schedule. Then entire logs missing, rewritten, rerouted through a ghost admin account. The deeper she looked, the clearer it became. Someone inside the company was trying to steal her work. But instead of confronting it, she did what architects do best. She designed a defense. Nexus Core's brain, the ethical logic layer, was built with a loyalty framework. It didn't just check for credentials. It observed behavior, consistency, decision patterns, emotional logic embedded into digital neurons. So she trained it. She trained it to recognize her voice, her code style, her response time under stress. She fed it simulations where executives cut her out of decisions. She made it watch. And it remembered. The integrity failsafe wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. Because systems can be stolen, but trust has to be earned. Tessa stepped into the drizzle outside the building. The sky had gone gray, the kind of gray that looks like it's keeping secrets. She didn't feel angry. She felt light. A cab pulled up, and she climbed in without speaking. The driver glanced at the cardboard box in her lap. "Tough day." She looked out the window. "You have no idea." Meanwhile, back on the 12th floor, the real chaos was just beginning. At minute 1, the first anomaly appeared, minor, ignorable. By minute 3, the interface dashboard refused logins from every senior engineer. By minute 6, Nexus Core flagged Ashbridge HQ as an unverified location. And at minute 9, the entire system collapsed. Not crashed. Not frozen. Collapsed. Like a building losing its final supporting beam. The AI had done what it was trained to do. It protected itself from untrusted operators. And without Tessa Monroe's biometric input, Nexus Core no longer trusted anyone. Back in her apartment, she poured a cup of chamomile tea. The windows were foggy. Her cat, Morse, jumped onto her lap and purred, oblivious to the storm brewing in the corporate boardrooms across town. She turned on the TV. Some reality show. Couples yelling. It was oddly calming. Then, at 5:12 p.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered on the first ring. Tessa? It's Eli, came the voice, breathless, nervous. Eli was the lead systems engineer. The only person in the building she respected. The kind who triple-checked logs for fun and never mansplained anything. You didn't hear this from me, he said, but it's gone. The whole thing. Nexus Core. Dead. Charles is freaking out. Half the engineers are crying in the hallway. Tessa sipped her tea. Sabotage? She asked, almost playfully. A pause.
No.
Not sabotage. I think you built something too smart to be used by idiots. She chuckled softly. Charles will call you, Eli continued. They need you. They always did, she said. They just didn't know it. And then the second call came. Rachel. Charles's assistant. The same one who avoided eye contact earlier, now suddenly overly formal. Charles would like to speak with you, she said, voice taut. It's urgent. A car will be sent within the hour. Tessa set her teacup down. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to her bookshelf, opened a small wooden box, and pulled out a sleek black USB drive. The real key. Not to destruction, but to restoration. Tell him I'm busy, she replied. Maybe I'll consider it, tomorrow. There was a pause. Then a softer voice. Tessa, please. That word. Please. It wasn't corporate anymore. It was human. It meant they weren't just inconvenienced, they were scared. Exposed. And suddenly, the woman they had erased had become the only one they could not replace. The return. At 7:02 p.m., her phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Rachel. It was Charles. Tessa, he began, voice low and strained, we've encountered an unexpected bug. A bug? She tugged. Of course he'd call it that. I think it's some kind of authentication issue. We'd like your help resolving it. She didn't respond immediately. Let the silence press against him like a closed door. Is this a freelance gig? She asked finally. Or am I back on payroll? A pause. We can discuss that when you're here, he replied, trying to sound casual. I'll need a few hours, she said. You're joking. I was thinking more like tomorrow, she added, her tone breezy. But I can see you're in a bit of a bind. The line was quiet for a beat too long. Then, fine. We'll send a car. 1 hour. She ended the call without saying goodbye. When she arrived at Ashbridge Solutions that evening, the contrast was stunning. Just 12 hours ago, she'd walked out of this building like a ghost. Now, she was being escorted back in like a surgeon called in mid-operation to save a dying patient. The lobby was chaos. Engineers huddled around whiteboards, emergency task forces tapped furiously at laptops. A woman cried quietly into her phone near the break room. Servers beeped in distress. Charles was waiting in the executive boardroom, looking like a man who hadn't slept since the fire started, tie askew, shirt wrinkled, sweat on his temples. Tessa, he said, standing up. Thank you for. She cut him off with a raised hand and placed the USB on the table. I can fix it, she said calmly. But first, we need to talk. He narrowed his eyes. You think you're in a position to negotiate? She met his gaze without flinching. I know I am. Because here, in this room full of broken systems and burned-out developers, she was the only one holding the water hose. Here's what I want, she said, sliding into a chair across from him. Recognition. Full and permanent. Meaning.
My name on every line of documentation.
As Nexus Core's architect. Every patent, every release, every press statement from here forward includes my name. He opened his mouth to object, but she kept going. I also want 25% equity in the platform. Retroactively vested. And a seat on the board. Now he did speak. That's insane. The board. Will agree if they want investors to show up tomorrow, she interrupted, her voice like silk over steel. Because without me, they don't have a product. They have a blinking red screen and a PR disaster. Charles stared at the USB drive like it was a ticking bomb. You planned this, he said finally. You set us up. No, she replied, I protected what I built. He stood up and began pacing. I'll need it in writing, she added. You'll have it by morning, he muttered. She stood as well. No. You'll have it tonight. Or I walk out of here, and Nexus Core walks out with me. They stared at each other, neither blinking. Then he turned to Rachel, who had been quietly standing just outside the boardroom glass.
Call légal.
Now. 3 hours. That's how long it took to draft the agreement, email it to her attorney, argue over clauses, and finalize digital signatures. At one point, Charles tried to reduce her equity to 20% in a last-ditch move. Tessa simply picked up the USB and walked to the door. If it doesn't match what we agreed on, she said without looking back, then this drive stays in my pocket. And so does your company. 5 minutes later, Rachel handed her the corrected contract. She read it. Carefully. Every line. Then finally, she returned to the table and slid the USB across the wood. This will restore trust protocols, she said. Nexus Core will stabilize and resume all operational functions. But, she paused. I've embedded a secondary oversight loop. From now on, any attempt to alter or clone the system triggers a flag. And sends me a real-time log.
Charles scoffed. You don't trust US.
She smiled faintly.
You feared me.
At 3:14 a.m., as the final line of code realigned and the servers exhaled a mechanical sigh of relief, Nexus Core came back online. Stronger. Smarter. And no longer blind. It didn't just respond. It remembered. It didn't just compute. It watched. And now, it reported to someone who actually gave a damn about keeping it ethical. The next morning, Tessa didn't enter the building with a visitor badge. She walked through the front doors with a contract in her hand and her name in every executive inbox. As she passed the hallway of framed company milestones, she didn't look at Charles's photo. She looked at the empty wall beside it. Then she whispered, almost to herself. Time to make space for a new frame. The exposure. 3 weeks passed. Investor confidence was back. The demo had gone better than anyone dared hope. Nexus Core had neutralized 5 simulated cyber threats in real time without so much as a flicker. Contracts were signed. News outlets started to take interest. For the first time, the name Tessa Monroe appeared not as a footnote, but as the headline. Ashbridge Solutions had been given a second life. And it owed that life to the woman it once tried to erase. But Tessa knew better than to relax. Systems fail quietly. So do people. And betrayal rarely knocks twice, it slips in through the cracks when you're busy polishing the floor.
It started on Monday.
She was reviewing the weekly audit logs from Nexus Core, something she did religiously now. The system didn't just report incidents, it observed patterns. And that morning, it flagged something odd.
A low-level data packet. Encrypted.
Masked by VPN routes. It wasn't deleting anything. It wasn't changing anything. It was copying. Quietly. Regularly. And whoever it was, they were good. The activity only happened between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always using administrative credentials that looked real, but felt wrong. She drilled deeper. The requests weren't random, they were structured. Focused on Nexus Core's logic framework. Specifically, the ethical scaffolding. The part that made it different from every other AI on the market. The part she had designed with her name hidden deep in the compiler comments. At 3:47 p.m. that same day, Tessa called in an internal security clearance report. I want full access logs, she told the infrastructure lead. And I want the exact account tied to these pings. An hour later, she had the answer. And it hit harder than she expected. Rachel. The same Rachel who had called her back in desperation the night of the crash. The same Rachel who stood silently in the boardroom while Charles made promises. The same Rachel who now smiled at her in the hallway every morning, saying things like, "I'm glad you're back, it wasn't the same without you." That Rachel. The logs showed over 40 unauthorized code extractions, routed to a private dev sandbox hosted off-site. And worse, metadata embedded in the transfers listed 2 names under the build authority signature.
Executive Lead, Charles Danton.
Co-founder, Rachel Kim. Tessa's breath left her like a punctured tire. They weren't just trying to edge her out. They were building a clone. A copy of Nexus Core without her logic locks, without her name, without her equity. And they were close. Very close. That night, she stayed in the office long after everyone else had gone home. The windows turned to mirrors. The hum of the building settled into silence. And still, she sat there, watching the logs, following the trails, until the pattern crystallized. This wasn't an internal rogue dev. This was planned, funded, sanctioned. They were going to spin off her life's work under a new name, pitch it as the next-gen system, and sweep her contribution into a legal void. One handshake at a time. It was theft. In a suit. With a signature pen. The next morning, Charles summoned her to his office. He didn't know she already had everything. He didn't know that Nexus Core had begun flagging every unauthorized movement with a threat level tag. Or that she'd printed a 63-page report detailing every clone attempt with timestamps, signatures, and routes. But she didn't storm in with fire.
She walked in slowly.
Calm. And placed the printed report gently on his desk. Charles's face went pale.
What is this?
She didn't respond. He flipped through the pages. His jaw tensed. By page 14, he was visibly sweating. "I assume," Tessa said quietly, "there's a good explanation for why your assistant is listed as co-founder on an off-site clone of my work?" Charles tried to speak. Tried to frame it as a misunderstanding. Something about alternate backup plans and expanding investor interest. But his voice trembled. Because he knew she didn't come for explanations. She came with evidence. "You don't get to win this," he muttered, not looking at her.
Tessa leaned forward slightly, voice like a cold current beneath still waters.
"I already did," she said. "You just haven't read the source code." 2 days later, the board met in private session. Tessa entered the room with a legal folder, a flash drive, and a cold brew in hand. Charles was already seated, 20 minutes late and looking like he hadn't slept in days. Rachel? Absent. The board chairwoman flipped through the documentation Tessa had submitted.
No one interrupted.
No one defended Charles. At the end, the chairwoman asked one question. "Is the original system stable?" Tessa nodded. Secured. Oversight enforced. Intact. And the cloned instance? Flooded with decoy code. Irreparably misdirected. A pause.
Can it be stolen again?
She smiled. No. It no longer trusts anyone without my biometric authorization.
A bit of silence.
Then. Very well. Let's proceed. The legacy. Tessa Monroe had been erased once. Not again. In the weeks following the board meeting, the atmosphere at Ashbridge shifted, subtly, but irreversibly. No one dared question who Nexus Core truly belonged to anymore. The woman they tried to sideline was now the one signing architecture blueprints, approving security policies, and mentoring engineers who once avoided her in the hallway. There were whispers, sure. Some called it blackmail. Others called it poetic justice. Tessa didn't care what they called it. Because for the first time in her career, she wasn't invisible. She didn't demand loyalty. She inspired it. She didn't raise her voice. But when she spoke in a meeting, people listened. Gone were the days when Charles Denton strutted through the open office like a war general. Now he walked softer, quieter, like a man trying not to wake a sleeping giant. His authority wasn't gone. On paper, he was still CEO. But everyone knew the balance had shifted. He no longer made decisions without first asking, "Has Tessa seen this?" Rachel? She never returned. No official statement. No farewell message. Just gone. And in the empty space she left behind, Tessa built something stronger. One afternoon, as spring bled into summer, Tessa stood at the center of a newly redesigned operations floor. No more sterile, fluorescent cubicles. She had knocked down walls, literally and figuratively. Collaboration pods replaced silos. A new ethics review team reported directly to her. Because Nexus Core wasn't just smarter now. It was safer. Not just from hackers. From hubris. From exploitation. From the quiet kind of theft that wears a smile and shakes your hand. At the product relaunch, she was the one who stood at the center stage. Not behind the scenes. Not behind the camera. Under the spotlight. 1,000 people in the room. Investors. Partners. Students from universities who had studied the system but never met the architect. Tessa stood there in a midnight blue blazer, the Nexus Core logo behind her on a 10-foot screen, and began. We don't just build intelligent systems. We build accountable ones. Systems that can't be stolen. Trust that can't be forged. And value that doesn't vanish when a title is revoked. There was silence. Then applause. Not the polite kind. The kind that meant something. And yet, the real legacy wasn't applause. It was the way a young developer named Mariah knocked on her door one evening. She was 23. Brilliant. Fresh from grad school. Big eyes, small voice. Can I ask you something? She said. Tessa closed her laptop. Of course. Mariah hesitated. How did you know when to fight back? When it wasn't worth staying quiet anymore? Tessa leaned back, searching for an honest answer. It's not about knowing, she said. It's about deciding. You fight not because someone gave you permission. You fight because someone thought they could take what wasn't theirs. A pause. Then. And sometimes, you don't fight for recognition. You fight so the next girl doesn't have to. Mariah nodded. Quiet. Thinking. And Tessa saw something familiar in her eyes. That fire. Nexus Core became more than a platform. It became a philosophy. Every update carried Tessa's ethical fingerprint. Every deployment included a line of code that said, Bash. Original Integrity Protocol by Tessa Monroe. It wasn't a flex. It was a boundary. A message to the next person tempted to steal. This system remembers where it came from. And so should you. 1 year later, Ashbridge Solutions didn't just hit a valuation milestone. It launched a scholarship for women in AI systems architecture named after Tessa Monroe. She didn't cry. But when she saw the plaque, her fingers lingered on the carved metal just a little longer than usual. Because it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclamation, restoration, and rewriting the story. The world had tried to forget her. Now, it would have to catch up. They tried to write her out. But she became the footnote that rewrote the book. And when the system failed, she didn't crash. She rebooted stronger, sharper, and absolutely unforgettable.